So there's a lot of pessimism about democracy right now.
There is.
And I think that it is overdone because I do think that a number of developed democracies actually have got this thing pretty well in hand. So, a lot of Commonwealth, Canada, Australia are actually much better governed than the United States right now. Germany, I think in terms of a constitution that balances the need for participation and managing diversity over territory with its federalism, and yet having a strong state that is able to act on things, has gotten the balance. They didn't get it right in Weimar. They created a government that was too weak, and it didn't survive, the 1930s. But I think when they redid it under the Federal Republic, they did a pretty good job. And so it's not as if, this imbalance is happening everywhere. But there are a number of very weak democracies right now, I think, where the state doesn't have enough authority to actually do things. I would say Japan has had a little bit of that problem. India, and I would say the United States. Italy is another case where you don't have the underlying social consensus, and therefore you don't have the ability of government to actually solve, the problems facing the society.
Over 20 years looking at that theory, have you come to modify it or see it as redundant in some areas where you didn't expect it to be and really useful in others?
You mean the three political... well, I only thought of it a few years ago, so it's a framework that I find useful for explaining the world. I think it's a modification over what I wrote in the original End of History book.
Yes.
Because the thing that I did not appreciate there is how difficult it is to create a modern state. Right? A modern state is different from what Weber called a patrimonial state. A patrimonial state is what most of the world has, where the state is basically the property of the rulers who use it to extract resources in a predatory fashion from their society. A modern state makes a clear distinction between public and private, and if you're a public official, you're supposed to serve public interests and not your private or your family interests. And there's really a very small number of countries that have actually made that transition, probably not more than a couple of dozen, altogether. And I think what I never really appreciated is exactly the state capacity issue is how do you make that transition when you have a state whose power is based on essentially webs of patronage, entrenched rulers have a very strong personal interest in maintaining, this predatory position and are extremely difficult to dislodge. And I think that's kind of the central problem. Much harder to solve that problem than to solve the question of democracy, which is, by contrast, I think pretty easy, holding elections and the like.
Yes, although elections, we have lots of elections in Russia. You might not call them democratic. Elections sometimes can be an icon of something other than democracy. But the shift to seeing identity politics is so important. Did you also underestimate that when you were younger and perhaps more open-hearted or naive?
So I have to make a plug for myself.
Of course.
That actually, nobody actually read the whole book, The End of History and the Last Man. And the last man part of the book, this comes from Nietzsche's idea about the last man who emerges at the end of history, is a person who doesn't have pride, who has, he called them men without chests. And what I argued back then is that one of the things that's going to destabilize our peaceful democratic world is precisely this surging of pride, that people want to have esteem in themselves, and they want to have esteem based on not their universal characteristics as human beings or citizens, but because they're members of specific groups. And so nationalism is a version of this. But there's many forms of identity politics today in the world. Religion, I actually think that a lot of radical Islamism is driven more by a search for identity than by genuine piety. So I did recognize that this, was there and could potentially destabilize the world. Unfortunately, a lot of that has come true, and democracy therefore is under threat by charismatic leaders that want to use the legitimacy given to them by these appeals to identity to overturn the liberal part of a liberal democratic order.
And how does immigration feed into that?
Well, so this I think is the single thread that really underlies a lot of today's populism in the rich world, but also in poor countries as well, where so first of all, just if you look at statistics, the number of people crossing international borders is really quite extraordinary right now, and they move in one direction. I mean, a lot. So I was thinking about this when Ricardo was talking about how do you get knowledge into a country. The problem right now is that there are not a lot of smart, well-educated people, apart from Ricardo and his colleagues, that want to go to poor countries, right, generally speaking. The flow is almost entirely in the opposite direction. And although this is good from an economic standpoint, this kind of labor mobility, when you consider people just as individuals and you add up all the individual utilities involved, it's not necessarily good for countries. And so what it's doing right now is producing this huge backlash in the receiving countries. And so I think that the single issue that has motivated Brexit voters is really foreigners, right? That a lot of the Brexit voters think the EU is responsible for their country filling up. And it's been quite remarkable, like 900,000 Poles moved to Britain in a 2-year period recently, right? That's a lot of people. So a lot of social change, and it's perceived as a cultural threat. But the other flip side of this, I mean, I spend a lot of time in Eastern Europe and the Balkans and former communist world, and that part of the world is actually getting depopulated. I mean, you're getting, the Baltic countries have lost like a third of their population in the last couple of decades. I mean, 20-30% of young people have just gotten up and left, and they're the most educated and the ones with skills. And so I think that basically what's been happening in Europe is the Schengen system has been sucking all the talent out of the periphery and sending it to Germany and Netherlands and Britain, and it's causing political problems on both ends. And so I think that that's a system that really needs to be rethought in a certain way.
Yeah, free movement, though, is, of course, a pillar of the European Union. Interestingly, there's a lot of evidence that a lot of Europeans are going back home, partly because the pound has fallen so significantly since the Brexit vote. So they're literally not earning as much to send back.
Right.
And secondly, because they feel very unwelcome. There's also some evidence that the real immigrants that a lot of Brexit, not all voters wanted to get rid of, were immigrants with a different coloured skin.
Yeah, there's definitely that racial element.
There are many layers in all of that. You talk about cultural change and how states can start increasing their capacity by building a sense of national identity. And you talked about music and about language. Do you just want to elaborate a bit more on that?
Well, so this is one of the big problems. Actually, I should have mentioned it in the talk itself. So language was really important in the case of both Nigeria and Tanzania. The problem is that you can't do this except under authoritarian government, right? You can't declare that something like Swahili is going to become the national language of this very diverse territory unless you've got a dictatorship that says basically this is what we're going to teach. And that's what happened, under Sukarno in Indonesia in the early days. And this is one of the kind of hidden weaknesses in the democratic self-understanding of how democracies got to be where they are, because every existing consolidated democracy, Germany, Britain, France, Netherlands, so forth, actually became a nation in the sense of this common identity that was actually built around common ethnicity under authoritarian conditions before they democratized. And it's much harder to see how a democratic society that has to adjust to all sorts of interest groups and the actual diversity of the people living, in their territory is ever going to decide on that single narrative and create this kind of, it's not impossible because I think some democracies have succeeded in doing it, but it does require a lot of visionary leadership and, the right feel for, the cultural memes that are actually going to get responses out of people people have to respond with their emotions and not just with their intellect.
And language is such a visceral, emotional identity signifier, isn't it? It's
right.
who you are in many, many ways. I was interested when you talked about Catalonia, because under Franco, Catalans were not allowed to speak their language. Right. I go to Catalonia quite a lot, and they used to go up into the mountains to speak their own language, and you can repeat that throughout all sorts of places. So when the lid is lifted, often the repressed anger and need to clutch identity emerges. We saw it in Yugoslavia as well, where it turned violent.
Right.
What do you how do you make sense of that within? I mean, you've talked about you need a repressive regime. You had one, but you lift the lid and it goes democratic.
Yeah.
And suddenly you have very angry people.
So it's a difficult issue because sometimes the repression actually works because it lasts long enough that people kind of get used to it. In other times, like the Soviet Union was a good case of that, where they denied that ethnicity existed well, they didn't deny it, but they basically said it had been transcended. And then the moment the authoritarian power left, it all came roaring back. So I think that rulers have to create an alternative story. I mean, that's the basic thing. It can't simply be, and actually both in the case of Bahasa Indonesia and Swahili, it was important that neither of those were majority languages, and the people that declared them to be the national languages did that deliberately because they knew that they could not take the language of one important group and make it dominant, so they didn't make Javanese the national language of Indonesia. So I do think it requires this kind of, you have to be smart as well and appreciate the fact that this diversity exists, and you have to make certain, concessions towards it as you're still trying to come up with a narrative that, is in some way integrating.
So what alternative stories did you think happened in the examples that you've given where it sort of worked? Do you know what the rulers said, what the state effectively said to the population?
Part of it is using the educational system. So if you actually go back in the case of Indonesia, this Pancasila, these 5 principles, Pancasila ideology, it was actually quite interesting because it was formulated in the 1920s before Indonesia became independent from the Netherlands. And it was actually quite a clever ideology because it was not religiously based. Islam is respected in Pancasila, but it is not the state religion in Indonesia because even back then, I think Sukarno and Hatta understood that the country was already, they had a lot of Christians and a lot of Hindus, and they could not make that the dominant religion. And so they basically crafted this completely bogus, made-up, ideology out of the components that were lying around in, the national experiences of all the diverse groups that lived in Indonesia, and then they blessed that as the, as the national story. And so,
Must take quite a long while, though, to kind of embed it, because cultures don't often change from the top down.
Well, so that's why I'm saying you really do have to have this two-way, movement, that if civil society and the grassroots is not producing the memes that, the rulers then try to exploit, it's not going to work.
Okay, very interesting. Who's got a question for Frank? That was quite a rich and wide-ranging discussion. Any questions? At the back. Could you wait for a microphone to come? And if you could tell us who you are, that would be very useful.
Thank you very much. Arturo Franco, I work for MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth. I was also a student of Ricardo a long, long time ago. Thank you, Professor Fukuyama. That was a very great, very good lecture. You talked a lot about the process of building identity in the cases that you're mentioning right now in Indonesia, but you touched very little, just basically on India and the process of losing identity. I come from a country, Mexico, which when I was growing up seemed to have a narrative, a story, at least from what I remember, and it seems to be going into a process of losing its identity. And I just wanted to ask how you relate that to the economic complexity theory, in the sense that if you go from a society that has little letters to a very complex economy, does that also affect how people see themselves as part of the system and perhaps leads to losing identity?
So I think that any modern society is going to be diverse. It will be diverse ethnically and religiously because people move around, and it's certainly going to be diverse in terms of occupation. I mean, the whole modernization story, from the earliest modernization theorists was all about the division of labor and how, modernization, economic modernization produces a complex division of labor and lots of diversity. And therefore, the identity story has to change, right? So, and that's really the problem in Europe right now, because the inherited identities of Germany, the Netherlands, Italy, and so forth, were all ethnically based. That's the really big challenge they've got right now. So if you get up and say, I'm a German or I'm an Italian, and you're Muslim and you're dark-skinned, people there are going to say, no, you're not. You're somebody else. You're not an Italian. Mr. Salvini has made claims like that. And that is simply not acceptable. I think that you have to have an identity today in a modern, complex society that is what I call creedal or civic, which means that it has to be based on ideas that are accessible to the actual diversity of people that live in that society. And therefore, I think they have to be built around the ideas of democracy itself. You have to believe in your constitution or a rule of law or principle of equality or some underlying political idea that everybody can share in regardless of their specific point of origin. And that's a transition that a lot of rich countries have not made yet. And I think they're storing up problems because they have become de facto diverse in this sense.
That's a very idealistic view of humanity, if I may say so, that people will internalize an idea. I mean, some Americans talk passionately about the Constitution. A lot don't even know what it is, really. So how do you get people to internalize and feel emotional and connected to something as abstract as the Constitution?
Well, I think that it's happened in a number of countries. And so, like I said, I would single out the United States, France, and India, actually, as three countries whose political processes produced this kind of a liberal identity. This was basically in India, this was the work of Gandhi and Nehru to, they deliberately did not want to do what Pakistan did and base their identity on religion. And that was a very positive thing that held the country together for quite a number of decades. I think the French, despite the fact that there's discrimination and racism, also have a very powerful sense of citizenship that comes out of the French Revolution that is based on underlying political principles. And so I do think that there are cases. And so the United States is a complex case because we actually did have a racially and ethnically based identity before the Civil War. Blacks and Native Americans and women were not considered citizens. And so this is part of the story of why nation building is such a violent act, but you actually had to fight a civil war that kills 600,000 Americans before you can establish the fact that citizenship is going to be birthright and not racially based. And then it takes another 100 years of pretty continuous political struggle to make that a reality in law, not even just in society, but simply in law, to get rid of Jim Crow and so forth in the South. But I would say that by the time you get to the end of the civil rights era in the 1960s, you did have the emergence of a kind of sense of American national identity that really was much more civic than it had been in previous ages, and I think that was a big accomplishment. One of the things that really worries me right now is that now you're getting people on the right that want to take us backwards, that want to revive
So that
this.
could have just been a blip, a
It could have
particular
been.
moment.
We'll see.
We will see. Any more questions? Gentleman there. And then we'll go to the gentleman next to you.
Hi, my name is Luis Felipe Davila from Center of Public Leadership in Brazil. The question is, populism today and nationalism are undermining the legitimacy of democracy. Can democracy survive without this sense of civility and civic virtue that's so fundamental?
Well, that is the number one question. And I think the answer depends on the particular country and its traditions. So in Hungary, for example, I think that Viktor Orban has actually succeeded in weakening the courts, weakening the press to a point where Hungary, is beginning to not really qualify as a true liberal democracy. It's turning into an illiberal democracy, as he has talked about. Poland is in a little bit less serious of a situation for a variety of reasons. In this country, I think you have exactly the same threats, where you've got a president that basically has been attacking the liberal institutions that are supposed to constrain the presidency, so the FBI, the Justice Department, the mainstream media is the enemy of the American people. But I think that the traditions in the United States are pretty strong, protecting those, and so far they seem to have, contained him. We'll have to see. I think 2020 is going to be a big year in terms of whether those institutions are really going to be made to work. The other, if there's a single point of optimism I could point to, it's the fact that these populists really don't have great ideas, on their own, particularly in terms of economic development. So Viktor Orban in Hungary, for example, has created a form of crony capitalism that is not a good model for economic development. And it's very annoying because the only reason Hungary seems to be doing well is that it gets 5% of its GDP in the form of EU subsidies. So even as he's attacking the hand that's feeding him, they're keeping him going in a certain way. But left to their own devices, I don't think the Hungarians would do particularly well. And I think the Brexit, so if there's a silver lining to the Brexit story, it's
There isn't one.
No, wait. If if Britain crashes out and it's as disastrous as it looks like it's going to be, I don't think any other country in Europe is going to consider doing anything like this.
Well, I'm glad we've led the way. We'll have to wait and see on that one. A question here.
Thanks, Professor Fukuyama. Luis Oganes, work in emerging markets research at JP Morgan. Following up on the question about populism, I was trying to put populism in the framework that you laid out at the beginning, your 6 boxes. What would you say is populism? Do you agree with the notion that the main reason is, probably the first box, that economic growth is not benefiting everyone, that you're having these haves and have-nots, and the income inequality widening? Is that, would you say?
So it's more complicated than that. I think that was the trigger for the rise of populism. But if that were all there were to it, then you would expect to see a lot more left-wing populism than these right-wing populist groups. And that makes me think that the cultural side of it, this identity side, is actually pretty important in explaining why it's the right that's been able to capitalize on inequality rather than the left. Now that may change, as time goes on, but it certainly indicates to me that issues like cultural threat, immigration, have been bigger factors than inequality per se. In terms of the boxes, I think you can visualize what's going on very clearly. There are the 3 political boxes. So you got the state, a modern state, hopefully, you've got rule of law, and you've got democratic legitimacy. And I think what's been going on is the democratic legitimacy box has been attacking the other 2 boxes. Politicians have been using the legitimacy they get from being elected and using it to undermine both the rule of law and the modern state. And that's really the danger that we're facing. It's not to democracy per se, it's to the things that constrain democracy. And
Lady here, please.
I'm Aminata Toure from Senegal. My question is, considering your model, I happen to be in government, so you have to juggle many balls at the same time and you want to make fast progress. So you wonder whether you have a hierarchy regarding this 6th element. Of course you don't. And I would like to add a 7th one, which is the international environment, because you might do well with your 6 boxes, and then you do have the international environment that is not conducive for different reasons. If you're Nigeria, you're not fixing the price of oil, for instance. I can come up with other example. So did you think about putting at the center of your model the human right-based approach, which brings all the citizens together? If we are equal in rights, the states as the duty bearers should deliver through your 6th element. And I would add to the 7th, all the international bodies we chair as human beings, the UN and the EU. Because what we are facing now is, in Africa, a situation where people are looking at China as the successful models. So when you come and people talk about democracy, that's what's the point of me voting, bringing somebody who is not solving my basic rights, and China doesn't have a democracy, but people are doing well, and it ends up being the first nation in terms of economics. So do you think that we have to rethink the development model and come up with the virtue the gentleman was talking about? And it seems that we all have surrounded, that objective, because it seems too complicated to the development community, but yet we have to come up with that because we were born with rights that we are bound to be enforced, but yet you don't see the place in the countries, apart from some activists and some crazy people, because we present it as such, and most of the time they lose election, by the way, and the international community that is left wondering, the UN being weaker and weaker, some of the states sitting at the Security Council not really defending this wonderful agenda that was the human rights agenda. So what are your thoughts about that?
So the human rights agenda is completely embedded in the model. I mean, the rule of law is not the rule of law if it doesn't apply to citizens equally. You know, the rule of law is there to protect the weak against the strong. And I think similarly, a modern state is impersonal. So it treats people on the basis of their being citizens and not just because they're friends or relatives of the rulers, right? So those ideals are embedded, you know, and if those boxes develop properly, you're going to get that protection. Now, this model is basically just a model, it's a domestic model of how individual societies develop, but you're right, they're surrounded by an international community that is pushing them in various different directions. Some of them are economic conditions, some of them are political, and I think right now China is a major competitor in a way that it was not 10 or 15 years ago, because it does seem to be stable and it's produced pretty good results. The problem, I think, right now is that, you know, you can't really, I think that there are a lot of problems in the sustainability of the China model, and there are even bigger problems in transferring that model to other countries, right? So if you could tell me how an authoritarian regime in Africa can develop a 2,000-year tradition of meritocratic bureaucracy, where you make everybody take an exam to get into the government and you promote them on the basis of their skills and ability. And if there's a lot of authoritarian countries trying to duplicate, that aspect, with all the respect for education and everything else that is part of Chinese civilization, then I say, yeah, go ahead, try it, see if you can make that work. The problem is that people are just going to adopt the authoritarian parts of the repressive parts of the China model without, the qualities, the institutionalized qualities that actually make the China model effective in China and in other East Asian countries. So that's a big danger. I admit that it's a big temptation that we need to combat.
I'm going to take a question from over here, and then we're going to have to wind up and move on. But obviously, Frank will be around later.
Professor,
tell us who you are.
Arbi Mazniku from Albania, Tirana. Is there a role in the model of the boxes for individuals like the Gandhis and the Churchills and some specific people in history that sometimes make a push that goes beyond the system or the boxes, and how can they fit in the theory?
So definitely in all of those boxes, things like individual leadership makes a great deal of difference. Again, it's something very hard to incorporate into economic models because it's kind of like a random number generator that you've suddenly thrown in the model, whether you get a good leader or not. But I think it does make a huge difference. So for example, a lot of what I was saying about the creation of a national identity from the top down is not necessarily using authoritarian power to force people to be a certain way. It is using authority, meaning people's voluntary acceptance of something that you're doing. So the example that I cite in the book was actually this film Invictus about the 1996 World Cup rugby competition in South Africa, where Nelson Mandela made this effort, it's part of the Rainbow Nation agenda, to actually get South African blacks to root for the Springboks, the almost all-white South African rugby team, because he felt that, sports was one of the ways that you create this kind of non-racial, national identity. It's unfortunately, Nelson Mandela isn't with us anymore, and that vision has kind of died. But I do think that while he was there, he actually created, a real idea of an alternative way of organizing the way that South Africans thought about themselves. And so I guess that's what I mean by, that's leadership. That's not the imposition of, authoritarian rules. It's really inspiring people to think about themselves in a different way.
Does that answer your question? Yes. Good. Okay, are we ready to move to the next session? Is our speaker here? 5 more minutes. Okay, we've got time for more questions. A gentleman over here, and then I know this gentleman over here.
Thank you. My name is Rami Ahmed from the Islamic Development Bank, but I happen to be Syrian too. Thanks for bringing the Syrian example, but in desperation and in search for a national identity, which doesn't seem likely to preserve all these 6 boxes, people tend to speak about the dividing the country. Could you compare this to the Iraqi example, and what would go into really the decision or the recommendation to avoid such division of the country? Thank you.
So I think that most of the efforts to solve these kinds of identity, internal conflicts within countries by separation works only if different groups are living in pretty compact areas that are pretty homogeneous. When this issue came up in the Iraqi case, I remember in the 2000s after the American invasion, a lot of people were talking about splitting up the 3 parts of Iraq. And the big problem with that was that these areas were not homogeneous. And so there's lots of both Sunnis and Shiites living in Baghdad. There's a lot of, only Kurdistan was a kind of relatively uniform area, but to actually separate these communities would require a fair amount of ethnic cleansing, right? I mean, that's the method to produce, ethnically homogeneous areas that then you can talk about separating. And I don't think anyone wants to pay the price for that. In Syria's case, in a way, it's sort of happened already, and you can see what the consequences of that are, which are not good.
Gentleman over here, and then a gentleman there. This man with the glasses has been patiently waiting.
Thanks so much, and Professor, thank you. I'm John Chisholm from San Francisco. At the risk of sounding illiberal, it seems that immigration is a Goldilocks optimization problem. And by that I mean neither too much nor too little is optimal. If there's too little, the country doesn't enjoy diversity of skills and knowledge and so forth. And if there's too much, it could well be disruptive. And so one approach is to try to figure out what's optimal and also ascribe to each candidate coming into the country some kind of score for how much diversity they bring. You can see why I'm skating on thin ice here and worried about this not seeming liberal in the European sense. It's going to be a lot easier for Moldova, for example, for Romania to invite somebody from Moldova, where the language is the same and the culture is essentially the same, than say from Russia. Or for that matter, it's probably going to be easier for somebody from Canada to assimilate and become self-sufficient in the United States than someone from a country that doesn't speak our language, speak English. So what are your thoughts on this kind of system for trying to optimize immigration?
So I am completing, as we speak, a paper that's comparing immigration policies between the United States, Canada, and Australia. And it's an interesting comparison because the United States right now has about 13% of its population born outside the US. Canada is about 20%, and Australia is like 23, 24%. So Canada and Australia have significantly larger numbers of foreign-born than the United States, and they basically have no right-wing backlash populism, anti-immigrant populism, right? And so the question is, why is this the case? And what I'm trying to argue in this paper is that they actually are selective. Both of those countries have a point system. So the average immigrant comes into Canada. I mean, there basically is not illegal immigration to either country. The average immigrant that comes into Canada actually has a higher level of education than the average native-born Canadian. And so the attitudes towards immigration are really, quite different as a result of this. And yet they think that immigration is good and it's important for their economic growth. And so they actually are accepting a higher level than the United States accepts. So I do think that, that kind of selectivity, does make a difference. I think, the trouble is that sometimes that selectivity is used basically for racist purposes, right? So there was a time when, in fact, one of the earliest exclusion acts by any of these Commonwealth countries or the United States was against Chinese or Asians, right? That people said, well, Asians will never assimilate into our society. I don't know about that, and so you got to be careful about, your assumptions about who can assimilate and who can't, as long as, I think you need to accept a couple of principles, which is that, democracies actually do normatively have a right to control who is part of the people and who is not. So the democratic community can set that. I actually don't see how you can have a democracy if you can't make that fundamental decision. And then I think, basically immigration is a good thing for most countries, at some level, but you do have to worry about ultimately integrating people into a larger national identity. And, you want to take people that at a level that you think you can do that successfully. And I don't have problems with, that kind of a policy stance.
A lady at the back, and then this gentleman here, and then I think we are going to have to wind it up. Let's just see how long the questions are.
Hilda Ochoa, Washington, D.C., part of the Venezuelan diaspora. It occurs to me that something that has changed maybe over the last 30 years, certainly in the United States, I don't know to what extent in other countries, and probably as a result of social changes in all of the countries, is that the educational base that is given to the citizens is lacking some of the moral virtues or ethical virtues or Aristotelian philosophies that at some point in time were being provided to the children. I'm not aware of what is the current curriculum in education. I maybe even suggested that Mr. Fukuyama, you yourself work on a kind of common or uncommon curriculum that will teach at all private and public schools some basics of human philosophy, Aristotelian virtues, and other religious virtues that religions have disappeared also from. And that's a good thing and a bad thing. So we are missing that formative element of the ethical values that were at some point in time taught in our schools.
That's a pretty complicated question I think that actually every generation thinks that they are in a state of moral decline compared to the previous generation, and that's probably been going on for the last 1,000 generations or so. I think that the specific decline in the way that things like civics and history and so forth were taught in the United States, for example, really does have to do with our racial history because, quite frankly, when I was a kid, and certainly when my father was growing up in Los Angeles in the 1930s, the kind of view of American and Western history you got, first of all, was very Anglo-centric, so it's really all about the history of England, and it was whitewashing quite a lot of the injustices that actually existed in American society, in earlier historical periods. And so I think that you can have an overly rosy, view or nostalgic view of what the good old days looked like in terms of what we used to teach young people and the kinds of virtues we instilled. Because In most countries, you know, the education was being offered to a much smaller group that was much more elite, that was much more homogeneous, and right now we can't do that anymore, right? And I think you just got to get used to that, which means that you've got to teach, you know, other sorts of virtues that, you know, have a different kind of narrative, and that's kind of the challenge that's in front of us.
One last question, the gentleman here.
Hi, Arturo Brillenburg, Washington, D.C., also Venezuelan. Is there any lessons that we can learn from the period of nation building in the 19th century? For example, the collapse of the Habsburg Empire. Those nations were created. It took many years to teach people to speak Czech because they normally spoke German, and so is there any process to learn from that?
You know, that's a tough one because in many respects what replaced the Austro-Hungarian Empire, I mean, it was an authoritarian but a fairly liberal empire, and what replaced it was far more democratic, but it was also far more intolerant and aggressive in kind of the assertions of nationalism, and I'm not sure that the trade-off was all that great. But on the other hand, after World War I, you couldn't have kept the old empire together in any event, so it wasn't as if people had a choice in that. I think that, you know, what it teaches me is that you've got to preserve these liberal structures wherever you can, because in fact you have de facto diversity in, you know, many, many parts of the world, and if you do not create, you know, identities that are appropriate to that diversity, you're going to end up, you know, like interwar Europe.
Well, that's a gloomy note to finish on. I'm sorry, if you want to talk to Frank, and I know others have other questions, we have to move on to our next speaker. Can we show our appreciation for a fascinating talk and great questions?